Welcome to the Getty Center. My name is Wim de Wit. I'm the head of the Department of Architecture at the Getty Research Institute. Thank you. Both Thomas Gaetkens, our new director, the director at the Research Institute, and Gail Feigenbaum, the associate director for programs, who would have loved to be here, but had to go out of town and therefore send their regrets. So it's my great pleasure to introduce a personal friend and a friend of our institution, Jean-Louis Cohen. But before doing so, I would like to welcome some special guests. A very heartfelt welcome to Mr. Norbert Arnold, the Deputy Consul General of Switzerland. I just saw him. Where is he? Please stand up. Also, a welcome to Ms. Odile Foumont, cultural attaché of France, who is on her way up the hill. And I also would like to acknowledge Mr. Philippe Larieux, Consul General of France, Mr. François-Xavier Tilliette, the Vice Consul General of France, and Mrs. Tilliette, who are also on their way. When I first met Jean-Louis in the mid-1980s at a conference at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, I had a feeling that I had known him already for a very long time. In the mid-1970s, Jean-Louis was already a distinguished architectural historian whose path-breaking work on Russian avant-garde architecture was read widely, not only in his native France, but all over Europe. I don't know if Jean-Louis saw it this way, but to me, his research on this topic culminated in the outstanding exhibition Paris-Moscou at the Centre Pompidou in Paris in 1979. Throughout his career, Jean-Louis has remained interested in avant-gardes, not only of Russia, but also of Germany. He has written studies about Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and of course of his own country, France. He has written about Lursat, Perret, and Le Corbusier, the most important French architecture of the 20th century. All his writings have been and still are based on thorough readings, not only of the literature of the period, but also of the archives, which is one of the reasons why Jean-Louis' work is so stimulating to someone like me who collects those kind of archives and makes them available for research. And because Jean-Louis speaks so many languages, he's able to read primary materials that many others can only study through secondary sources, and his publications therefore have a depth that not many other people can bring to their work. Le Corbusier is very well represented in his long list of publications, starting with his well-known book, Le Corbusier and the Mystique of the USSR, which was first published in French in 1987, followed by his many contributions to the Corbusier centennial publication in that same year, his 2004 publication, Le Corbusier, 1887 to 1965, The Lyricism of Architecture in the Machine Age, his study, Le Corbusier, La Planète comme Chantier, published in Paris in 2005, and his introduction to Towards an Architecture, the publication of which we are celebrating today. And I should add here that this publication was declared to be one of the favorite books of 2007 by Nikolai Orusov in the New York Times. Towards an Architecture is not Jean-Louis' first publication for the Getty Research Institute. As I said in the beginning, he has been a friend of the Institute for a very long time and has been an advisor to our esteemed head of publications, Julia Bloomfield, for many years. In 1997, he wrote a foreword to our Russian modernism book, a catalogue of the Research Institute's very strong collections in this area. And in 2001, he was the editor of the book Karl Teige, Modern Architecture in Czechoslovakia. While immersing himself in all these research projects, Jean-Louis has also held teaching positions in Paris and New York. He's the Sheldon H. Solo Chair for, he holds the Sheldon H. Solo Chair for the History of Architecture at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. And Jean-Louis is the founder of the Cité d'Architecture in Paris. The French Minister of Culture invited him in 1997 to establish his architecture museum, combining both the Institut Français d'Architecture and the Musée des Monuments Français. And he stayed on in that position until 2003. And this museum just opened last year in the Palais de Chaillot in Paris. Now, after this introduction, I know that you can't wait to hear Jean-Louis himself, but first I need to remind you to turn off your telephones. And please welcome with me Jean-Louis Cohen, who will speak on Le Corbusier's Toward an Architecture, from the Bildungsroman to the Manifesto. Jean-Louis.
Thank you very much, Wim, for this very generous introduction. I will also start with a series of parallels of words of gratitude. This lecture today is related with publication, the long-awaited publication of a new English translation of Le Corbusier's main Manifesto, a book published in 1923 in Paris. This publication was supposed to be the last in the wonderful series published by the Getty Research Institute, Texts and Documents, a series which has completely reshaped the way of teaching architectural history and theory in the Anglophone world. I hope the series will continue. And of course, the work done for the Getty was achieved, which was translating the book, researching and writing the introduction, and of course producing a magnificent volume, which can be found in the hallway. The work done for this book was related to the energy, the dedication of the Getty Research Institute's first director, Cohen, who started the series, to the tenacious and energetic dealings of Julia Bloomfield, the head of the publications program, to the work of the designer, Chris Rowett, and of the editors and staff of the publications department at the Getty, Diane Mark Walker, a wonderful, absolutely unique copy editor, Sylvie Young, who did a part of the research, and many others in Julia's team. This said, was it necessary to do a new translation of Vers une Architecture? Of course, we know that the big works of literature are retranslated every other generation. One has discussed at long in the US a new translation of Marcel Proust, for instance, recently. And it is clear that Le Corbusier's book is a much shorter book than Proust's Recherche du temps perdu. It is a slender volume which had been published already in 1927 under a misleading title, Towards a New Architecture, was a complete betrayal of Le Corbusier's intentions. And the book was full of other mistakes, but had become so well known and had been so interiorized by the architectural community in the Anglophone world and beyond that I am convinced that many readers of the new translation will feel ill at home in the new text. Therefore, it was absolutely indispensable to add to this text, to this dry and yet wonderful text, an investigation on the history of one of the most important books. I forbid my students to use the term influential, so I will try not to use it myself. One of the most important, one of the most effective book in the architecture of the 20th century and beyond architecture in the entire cultural production of modernism. So the new translation and the new version try to explore how this unique book, a book which will determine and provoke many young people to become architects, and to a book which will also address a larger audience than professional audiences. It was interesting to see how this book had developed, how this book had been received, how this book had been constructed. Let me go back to this ad released in 1923 and read the text on the back of it. This book draws its eloquence from new means, its magnificent illustrations sustain, next to the text, a parallel discourse of great power. This new conception of a book through an explicit and revelatory discourse of illustrations allows the author to avoid ineffectual phrases and descriptions. The facts stand out before the eyes of the reader through the strength of the images. The text of the book is merely a guideline held out by a mind avid for clarity through the magnificent tumult of an era in which history begins to inscribe itself within the grandeur of calculations, the modesty and temerity of science, the lyricism of a century that pulls ahead of 100th century past. So a book considered as a breakthrough, as not only as a text, and even not much as a text in this ad, but as a complex printed object, if I may say so. Who was Le Corbusier at that time? We see our man in the middle of here, seated in Moscow, among fellow architects upon his maiden journey to the USSR in 1928, proudly showing to the photographer a book which might have been one of his. Le Corbusier in 1923 was still a relatively obscure architect. He was already rather well known as a publicist, writing in the pages of the magazine L'Esprit Nouveau. His book, Vers une architecture, comes after years of wandering through Europe, and hence my definition of the book also as a Bildungsroman and not only as a sort of history, intimate history of his wanderings, and not only as a manifesto. On the left, we see young Charles-Édouard at the age of 21 in Mansarde in Paris. On the right, we see him with his elder brother, Albert Jeanneret, and the painter Amédée aux Enfants around 1921 in his hometown town of La Chaux-de-Fonds. It is interesting that today we have here both diplomats from France and Swiss. Le Corbusier was born a Swiss. He decided in 1930 to become a French citizen. He had to in order to get some jobs in France, and it is well known that on his first ID, instead of putting architect at the line left for the profession, he wrote man of letters, homme de lettres. And homme de lettres, he was indeed one of them, a man of letters. He wrote thousands of letters throughout his life, many of them to his mom, very revealing ones. A lot of what we discover about this book comes about a lot of what I've discovered comes through letters sent to his mother. He started sending letters to his mother when he left for the first time Switzerland for Italy in 1907, and he stopped when his mother died at the age of 100 years, after having written to her almost twice a week. Why was it so? He had to demonstrate to his mother that he was, I have left my pointer somewhere, I don't know if there is a pointer, but because I would point to the man in the middle of the right side photo, Albert Jeanneret. Albert was the elder son, and in the family novel, Albert was the genius. The family spared no money to send Albert to good schools, to support him while he was studying musical composition in Germany. Young Charles-Édouard had to work and went to a very short professional school in order to become an engraver of watch cases, a profession which would completely disappear in 1911 with the development of wristwatches. So wristwatches. So young Charles-Édouard spent his entire life demonstrating to his mom that the failed future, Albert would fail as a musician, that his father, his brother was a failure in the making, and that he was really the great man of the family. Writing to his mother about his successes, about his trips, even about his loves, having a sort of intimacy with her in respect and sometimes against his own wife. Well, a very complex relationship indeed. Le Corbusier took his nickname of Le Corbusier in 1920. It is interesting to see that the three architects of modernism had all of three had problems with their names or their date of birth. Wright lied during his entire life about his date of birth. Mies van der Rohe was born Mies only, which in German means mediocre. For an architect of major ambition, it was not very good, so he changed his name in 1920, adding a sort of pseudo-noble name with Dutch connotations. So it's interesting to see that these three ambitious young people had to work on their persona and also on their identity to become the heroes they wanted to be. So Jean Rey started in life consuming a certain number of mentors and gurus. He consumed Auguste Perret. We see Perret on the right, playing accordion on the terrace roof of his famous apartment block on Rue Franklin, an apartment block built in concrete in 1903 for the first time in Paris, which was at the height of the first floor of the Eiffel Tower, a place from which Le Corbusier conceived the idea of building residences up in the air, of building high-rise residential buildings in order to reproduce the wonderful experience acquired in Perret's apartment. His Swiss guru before Perret had been the painter Charles Le Platonnier, his teacher at the École d'Art. He would also remain in very close contact with a Swiss writer named Ritter, William Ritter, who would guide his first steps in, for instance, in the realm of literature. From La Chaux-de-Fonds to Paris, from La Chaux-de-Fonds, a city shaped by industry, La Chaux-de-Fonds was, before 1914, a place where 50% of the world production of watches was made. So Le Corbusier was, from the beginning, immersed in the spirit of modern industry. From La Chaux-de-Fonds to Paris, Jean Rey went through a series of experiences. One of the most important ones was his discovery of Istanbul, of the Balkans, and of Greece during his his voyage to the Orient in 1911. We see him photographed on the Acropolis in 1911 by his fellow traveler August Klipstein. Here, I have to make another point. Very early in his life, Jean Rey became also a writer and a maker of books. And this component of his career begins only now to be re-evaluated. Le Corbusier published probably 40 books in his entire life, starting at the age of 25 with a slender volume on the left, a book dedicated to the condition of decorative arts and architecture in Germany. He knew Germany extremely well and tried to introduce into Switzerland, in France, the discoveries and the experiences of the German Werkbund of architects like Peter Behrens, working for the major electricity societies and for whom he had been a draftsman. This book was an enthusiastic story about the discovery of a modern country and its economy. On the right, we see another book which remained unwritten by Le Corbusier, but which is really a turning point in his life. This book, the title of the book is France ou Allemagne, France or Germany, an inquiry on the activity of two peoples. It's a history book. And I want here to insist on this aspect of Le Corbusier's reflection in this early part of his life. Le Corbusier was constantly trying to legitimate his position by grounding it in a historical narrative. The book he wanted to write in 1915, France or Germany, was meant to reject the accusations which were then made in France in respect to the Cubist and to the modernist artists. They were at that time considered by the mainstream press as German agents, as Bosch. In order to affirm that modern art was not an art of the hands, Le Corbusier resorted to a series of constructions, the main one being to say that the French art could not be German because German art had stolen everything from France. With the development of the war, the book became obsolete. He dropped it, but he didn't drop the idea of the principle of its layout, and didn't drop many of the intentions he had, which would resurface in the articles of L'Esprit Nouveau. The book Le Corbusier publishes is based on a series of essays published in L'Esprit Nouveau between 1920, founding of the magazine by Le Corbusier and the painter aux enfants, and 1922. We see here the first one, the first of the remainders to the architects on a volume published in 1920 in L'Esprit Nouveau. And here we see that from the beginning, the articles which were to be merged and which were to constitute the structure of the book were of two natures. On one hand, eyes that do not see the airplanes, a series of chapters devoted to the discovery of the modern world. On the right, regulating lines. I'm using the new translation proposed by John Goodman. Regulating lines, we have a series of chapters dealing with more permanent issues of architecture, proportions, composition, etc. Le Corbusier's book starts with a celebration of the engineer. Very remarkably so, Le Corbusier, young Jeanneret, had hated the idea of becoming an architect, which had been initially forced upon him by his master at the La Chaux-de-Fonds School of Art. He wanted to be an artist. He didn't want to be an architect, and he spent much time of his life scorning the architects. Here, for instance, he celebrates, and it's of course a page of history, Eiffel, the maker of the Garabie Viaduct in southwestern France. On the right, you see that his idea was a rather old one. It's a letter to Auguste Perret in 1914, in which he makes a sketch of a photograph he had seen in the office of Perret of this viaduct, asking for a photograph. This document is interesting because it shows that Jeanneret and young Le Corbusier rather completely ignored the architecture of Paris and France. It's interesting, revealing to read the correspondence with Perret, in which Jeanneret knows everything about Germany and advises Perret about Germany, but doesn't know a lot about France. So the book, which the various articles merge into the book, and the book itself doesn't show much contemporary architecture. It shows contemporary factories on the left, American factories. This building, the building you see on the left, is a gigantic building built by Cass Gilbert, the architect of the Woolworth building in New York, in Brooklyn for the US Navy during World War I. And on the right, Le Corbusier rejects the production of American architects. Beware, listen to the advice of American engineers, but beware of American architects. The proof is a building which had survived the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire, the Spreckels buildings by J. and Merritt Reed. Ironically, Le Corbusier didn't know that the building on the left was by Cass Gilbert, who was one of the most distinguished architects of America. He mistook it for an engineering structure. The book is interesting and fundamental in this new attitude of an architect. Jeanneret has become an architect, his building, and what he's interested at is, in a way, showing a world he pretends to understand better to his contemporaries. This world is a world of ocean liners, a world of cars and car brakes, like on the right. Interestingly, Jeanneret wrote in one of his wartime letters that he was so obsessed with these liners that his friends his colleagues in his class at La Chaux-de-Fonds used to call him, to give him the nickname of paquebot, liner. The interest Jean Rey has for automobiles is also related to his friendship with the new guru. After having broken with Perret, with Le Platonnier, his first master, with Ritter after the war, his new guru is Amédée aux Enfants, a painter who initiates Jean Rey to painting, and together they make in 1918 a common exhibition in Paris, which aspires at launching a new artistic movement, extending and criticizing Cubism at the same time, called the Purism. Aux Enfants was not only interested in cars, he was also a designer of cars, as one sees on the left, of car shapes, carrosseries, car bodies. And we see a car body designed by Aux Enfants and his brother. On the right, an important photograph for our story. The book of Le Corbusier was full of reminiscences of Greece, of the Acropolis he had visited, but also a book full of reminiscences of more recent trips. And one of them had been the trip he had made in 1921 with Aux Enfants in Rome. The photograph was shot in Rome by Aux Enfants' girlfriend, who was the sister of Paul Poiret, the famous couturier. And we see both friends in one of the Roman collections. Vers une architecture is heavily centered upon, on one hand, on America, on the other hand, on Rome. In order to understand what architecture is, and here we deal with one of the chapters discussing the permanent values of architecture, one has to learn the lesson of Rome. But the lesson of Rome is also present on the right side in the discussion of surface, with this picture of the cortile of the court of Saint Damaso at St. Peter's. During his first trip to Rome in 1911, Jean Rey had already, insisting upon calling him Jean Rey before 20 and Le Corbusier after 20, Jean Rey had made very important notations, and it is here I think very useful to underline that Vers une architecture was the final formulation of ideas he had on the spot in Rome. For instance, looking at the Vatican, we see on top his sketch of the Vatican from St. Peter's to the Belvedere. At the bottom, we see one of his sketches of the Aventine, and he writes in the margins, cubes, surfaces, silhouettes, lines, and chaos, geometric forms, and suddenly it becomes a silhouette. So he had a very keen interest for the assembly of these volumes. Another double page of his sketchbooks where we see how he reduces the shapes he observes in the streets of Rome, the Mausoleum of Hadrian or the Pyramid of Caius Cestius, to primary forms, which will become founding elements of his vocabulary. He also discovers in 1921, during his first trip, after having focused his attention on old Rome, he discovers the Rome of Michelangelo. And you see his extraordinary sketch on the top where he compares. I should find my pointer because, forgive me, it will be neater. Yes, okay. So we see here this confrontation. It's almost a visual pun between a section of the Colosseum and St. Peter's. And we see how, in a way, Le Corbusier reassembles his own Rome, which is made of ancient Rome, and Michelangelo's Rome. His love of Michelangelo, his discovery and his identification with Michelangelo will be extraordinary. This is a completely unknown little watercolor sketch of 1917. He had not yet studied St. Peter's, which is dedicated to Michelangelo tenderly and respectfully. So Michelangelo, as an architect capable of shaping not only the city, not only buildings, but also the city, in particular with St. Peter's, although the architecture of Michelangelo had been, according to Le Corbusier, betrayed by corrupt cardinals. His hatred for the Catholic Church was absolutely beyond any measure, and this was clear also as early as the 1920s. Le Corbusier also ruminated in the making of Vers une Architecture his failures as an architect and as a businessman. Between 1917 and 1920, he had failed to develop a business trying to build concrete houses and negotiating, trading building materials. He had failed, and with not only losing his money, but also losing the money of his family. The official myth in the Le Corbusier scholarship is that the house he had built for his parents in 1912 was too expensive to run and had to be sold for this reason. But the truth is that Le Corbusier siphoned the bank accounts of his dad to pay his business debts. He was even prevented to be a manager of societies by law, and one of the reasons of his partnership with his cousin Pierre was to use the name of his cousin, Jeanneret, like his one, in order to be able to set up a practice in Paris. Strangely enough, the letterhead of the practice bears the name Jeanneret without any first name. No Pierre, no Charles-Édouard, completely ambiguous. Besides the lesson of Rome, there are other lessons in the book, and here it is interesting to see where the rhetorics and the figures and the tropes used by Le Corbusier are grounded, and I will make only one example: eyes that do not see, cars, airplanes, ocean liners. This is one of the most mysterious statements of the book, and it can be brought back to a prose poem by Stéphane Mallarmé, The Future Phenomenon, the first sentence of which Jeanneret quoted in a letter to Perret in 1914. Mallarmé's text relates the discovery of, I quote, a woman from another time in the house of an exhibitor of things past, and ends in the following manner: when everyone will have contemplated the noble creature, a vestige of some already cursed era, some of them indifferent, since they will not have had the strength to understand, whereas others, devastated, their eyelids wet with resigned tears, will gaze at one another, while the poets of that time, feeling their deadened eyes rekindle, will wend their way toward their lamp, brains briefly drunk with a confused glory, haunted by rhythm and oblivious of existing in an era that had outlived beauty. Here we see the strength of metaphors throughout the literary life of Le Corbusier, metaphors collected in the writings of Mallarmé. Le Corbusier owned a volume of Mallarmé bought in 1910. Metaphors also taken sometimes from the writings of Nietzsche, Jeanneret, and later Le Corbusier was an avid reader of Zarathustra's. A very important aspect, of course, of Vers une Architecture, and it's one of the questions I've discussed in the introduction, is a rhetorical strategy which aspires at completely shocking and, in a certain manner, provoking the intelligence and the attention of the reader. The juxtaposition of the Parthenon and of the Delage car at the bottom as being two examples of mechanical perfection is one of them. The confrontation of the automobile and the house considered as a machine to live in is another one. The book is full of metaphors, oxymorons, paradoxes, totally unexpected comparisons. At the same time, the book is also a catalogue of Le Corbusier's work. And it is mounted and assembled according to a principle of montage, which is absolutely stunning, passing from wide views to detailed views and encompassing extremely different types of materials. We see, in particular, the mastery of Le Corbusier in the use of what is called, for instance, if we look at the right side document, in the use of what literary theorists call the paratext, all the different regimes of text in a book, from the main title, the subtitle, the use of the name of the author, the use of quotations, the manipulation here also of titles, even the use of the photographic credits to balance in a certain manner graphically the wing of the airplane. There is a mastery of the pages space which is absolutely what I would say, devastatingly provocative. Here we see also the changes and the anchoring of the book in the contemporary issues. Finally published under the title Vers une architecture, at some point the book was supposed to be entitled Architecture or Revolution. A very mysterious title, Architecture or Revolution, question mark. The mark is missing here. The answer, which is also the last sentence of the book, is revolution can be avoided. How? Thanks to architecture. What do we read here? Not an exactly political position. Le Corbusier was loosely on the right in the 20s after having been on the left in the teens, but the local socialists had expelled him from his position, his teaching position at La Chaux-de-Fonds, so he had drifted to the right. He would become left again at the end of the 20s, right at the beginning of the 30s, left at the time of the Popular Front, even more to the left during the Spanish War, before spending 18 months in Vichy during the occupation of France, in a city where usually a medical treatment keeps you for 6 weeks, so he had other reasons. Anyway, my point here is that Le Corbusier was probably more identifying himself with the French entrepreneurs, with the businessmen who were trying to fight against the social laws, who were trying to keep the social movement quiet, and hence this idea that reform and the use of a better residential architecture could defer, to some extent, revolution. Now let's look at what poet Paul Valéry, someone who with whom Le Corbusier tried to be in contact during that period, but Valéry was much closer to Perret. Valéry, in a very important essay on the book, talks about what he calls le physique du livre, the physical look of the book. And Le Corbusier was very alert to these questions. He was interested in laying out articles and books for many years, and he laid out very carefully his own book. Here we see two of many sketches kept in his archives in Paris, which show little drawings which were made after a major book for him and his generation, The History of Architecture by Auguste Choisy, a book he owned and in which he copied and later photo reproduced small axonometric drawings of major buildings from Mesopotamia to the Gothic. On the right, we see another page on which he produces an assembly of plans which were coming from Choisy or from his own sketchbooks made during the Italian or the Greek trips. Very important here to see that Le Corbusier was also a sort of, for himself, his own documentary agency, a sort of continuous archive producing and using and recycling materials collected over the years. Here we see also the work he would do with documents taken from the world of advertising, collecting. He was extremely interested in publicity, like many artists and architects and writers in the 20s in France and also in Germany. And running L'Esprit Nouveau was constantly chasing ads and chasing people who would would commission him pages and pages of ads. And here we see how he recycles an ad by Farman, a maker of airplanes, in order to illustrate on the left, to make illustration for the book. Another source of illustration is a really interesting one, is the world of prints and representations of historic cities. Here is an excellent example. I'm sorry that the slide is a little blurred on the left. This is one of the major drawings to understand Le Corbusier's theory of urbanism, and it's never mentioned by anyone. This drawing is so important that he recycles it constantly in his publications. What we see on the right is a very well-known engraving by Piero Ligorio's, which shows a view of it's called the image of the ancient city, engraved in 1561. Le Corbusier had discovered this engraving during one of his trips, not a trip to Greece or Germany, but a trip to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and he had made this tracing. And it's part tracing, part sort of interpretation, which is very important because what we see is an extension of the reflection of the Rome sketches on the pure volumes. The city, this looks like a city. It's a city which is slightly and significantly uncluttered in respect to Piero Ligorio's image on the right, a city which is in which architectural objects are floating and playing with each other. He would later use the term of objects of poetic reaction to describe these visual and spatial shocks. And what we see is the emergence of a city which is no longer made of continuous blocks and streets, but a city made of lonely objects. So this is what Piero Ligorio produces. And in Vers une architecture, Ligorio's drawing, reinterpreted by Le Corbusier, is combined with this interesting series of volumes taken from didactic charts used in elementary schools and extremely well known by Le Corbusier, as he had been to a Froebelian school in La Chaux-de-Fonds. This is also something he shares with Frank Lloyd Wright, who was trained by his mother to use Froebelian blocks, but Le Corbusier had the anti-Froebelian training, which was based on the notion of geometricizing every type of object from life, vegetal, or also object from geological objects and objects from daily life. Here we see the most amazing aspect, the most striking aspect of Vers une architecture when you start confronting the book with its, the materials used and the visual culture of the time, which is the manipulation of forms, the manipulation of images in particular. I had always wondered where Le Corbusier had taken the images of Rome used in the book, and once I was here during a rainy Los Angeles Sunday, I started looking, maybe it was a Saturday, it's closed on Sunday, I started looking at the boxes of old photographs in the GRI library. And I suddenly had a rather primitive thought. Being in Rome in 1921, Jean Rey would have done what every tourist was doing at that time. He would have bought prints by Alinari and others and taken them home. So I started looking at the Alinari photographs or Alinari competitors' photographs here, and I found most of the photographs used in many interesting manners in Vers une architecture. We see on the right here the Arch of Constantine, and it's simply it's a completely edited and cleansed version of the image we see on the left. So this is simply working by subtraction and using the art of the photographic, very primitive photographic retouching technique. Here is another very interesting and also rather simple strategy. The book is based, this page of the book, Rome and Us, with the subtitle La Rome des Horreurs, the Rome of Horrors. Here we have a principle of addition in which a contemporary building, the Palace of Justice, which had been completed literally the year of Le Corbusier's trip in 1921. So the Palace of Justice is confronted with Baroque interiors and Rococo interiors Le Corbusier hated because also of their association with the Rome of the corrupt cardinals. Here we have an example of multiplication. We see 2 pages of Vers une architecture, and on the left, a big plate of the Acropolis with a photograph by the Swiss photographer Boissonnat, a plate in a book, in a big portfolio, which was owned by Le Corbusier. I found the portfolio in the archives, and we see how, in fact, it generates by a sort of, by process of selection, of graphic selection, he selects the entablature and here the base in order to produce 2 pages of the book. Here we see another and more striking example, which is a principle of division and rotation. The image on the top is an image of the sacristy of St. Peter's and the apsis by Alinari. We see what Le Corbusier does. He cuts in half the image, he keeps the right side, and he flips it in order to have a symmetrical layout of the page. So it's another manipulation which is not so innocent. Even less innocent and well-known is well-known because it has been pointed to by many scholars, including, or probably beginning with Rainer Banham, but it was not so mysterious. On the left, a book Le Corbusier knew. We have the evidence. The book was in his library. He also bought a copy for Perret during the war, the First World War. And at the bottom, we see the silos built in Buenos Aires on the harbor of Buenos Aires and destroyed very, very recently. Le Corbusier, in order to, in a way, insist on their modernity, because they are there to stand for a discussion on volume, raises the series of little pediments on the top. This manipulation was very well known, and even, interestingly, Aux Enfants, in his memoirs, tried to take credit for it, very strangely. Other images, for instance, were not, by the way, and this is also interesting in respect to the genesis of the book, other images were not images which had been found in the German publications. Many of these images of industrial buildings had been given to Le Corbusier by Henri-Pierre Rocher. Rocher was one of Marcel Duchamp's most famous chess partners and a novelist, critic, and dandy who was also the writer of the little novel Jules et Jim, the base of François Truffaut's famous movie. And here is probably the most interesting of these manipulations. Literally, Photoshop before the hour. This charming little church of Santa Maria in Cosmedin in Rome is complete. It becomes a sort of transvestite on the right. Le Corbusier takes away this column here, very embarrassing if you want to affirm that this church is a sort of example of elegant composition before the excess of the Gothic and the Baroque, way before. We see also all the other columns in the back completely erased with black ink. The windows are covered, but the most interesting thing is probably the creation, this architectural creation of a sort of new architrave and new pillar, which is completely square. So we see Le Corbusier using the language of domino to rewrite the history of early Christian architecture. Very mysterious also is, of course, the end of the book. On peut éviter la révolution, and in a quasi-surrealistic manner, on peut éviter la révolution is adjacent to the reproduction of a pipe. A very mysterious very mysterious pipe in a way. One could probably see this pipe as deriving from Mallarmé's prose poem La Pipe, with a certain nostalgic cast. The inclusion was a last-minute idea, for the object was photographed as the result of an exchange with the critic Georges Besson, born in the manufacturing center of Oyonnax, where most pipes were produced in France. Le Corbusier had communicated to him, I quote, his furious desire to know the works of art that you fabricate at Saint-Claude, calling the pipe a precious instrument, which was perhaps a signature of Le Corbusier himself, who was using it a lot at that time. And oddly, it was with regard to this, I quote, exquisitely anonymous, end quote, instrument that Lewis Mumford would remark in his book Techniques and Civilization, how Le Corbusier was, I quote, very ingenious in picking out manifold objects buried from observation by their ubiquity, in which this mechanical excellence of form has manifested itself without pretense or fumbling. So another aspect which is really, yes, and it is very amusing to realize that the presence of the pipe was so puzzling that the very rational German art historian Hans Hildebrandt replaced it in the German, in the German translation with a dirigible. So, yes, one last thing probably about these visual strategies of Le Corbusier. They were really read and captured by the contemporaries. They were not overlooked by the critics. And I would here, if I find my page, I would here return to the way in which, for instance, art historian Elie Faure discussed these pages, but I think I've lost my quote, and I will, and you will forgive me. But yes, this strategy of confrontation, of shock from page to page and within the same page was clearly meant not only at épater le bourgeois, but essentially at mimicking what the press was producing at that time. In a way, the L'Esprit Nouveau articles and Vers une Architecture transport to the serious realm of the architectural literature a principle of assembly which was very banal in the main press at that time. Le Corbusier functioning as a sort of guide to a new world, which was also the world of the factory shapes we see on the left. The book is concluded not only with a pipe, this is the last double page, but also with the extraordinary futuristic factory of Fiat at the Lingotto in Turin. The book was meant to be a propaganda tool, but also to be a marketing instrument, and it worked quite well. It is, for instance, upon his own admission, I found the letter in the archives after having read the book that Henri Frugès commissioned Le Corbusier with his first serious housing development near Bordeaux, the Pessac housing scheme. We see here a contemporary view. Le Corbusier and his wife Yvonne in 26 at Pessac at the time of the opening. The book was also, which would become an instrument of socialization and of course of influence for Le Corbusier, would also become an object of contention and of tension, even the object of a rupture with Amédée aux Enfants. Here is an absolutely extraordinary caricature which I found in a private archive with a copy at the Le Corbusier Foundation. The drawing is by Le Corbusier in the early 1930s. After 5 years of polemics with Amédée aux Enfants, he sends the drawing. What had happened? I've not commented upon the signature of the book. On the first edition, the book was signed Le Corbusier Saunier, pseudonym which was the assembly of Le Corbusier, and Saunier, the pseudonym of Aux Enfants, as if the book were the common work of the two friends. In fact, Le Corbusier could not but acknowledge at that time the determining presence and the determining contribution of Aux Enfants. In the second printing, the second part of the name, Saunier, was dropped, and Le Corbusier publicly took credit for a book. After having, it is true, in the first version also thanked Aux Enfants as to distantiate himself from his friend. Aux Enfants was, of course, furious and started fighting with Le Corbusier. They broke up in 1925, interrupting the publication of L'Esprit Nouveau. And Aux Enfants beginning then to continuously complain and in his letters to Le Corbusier that Le Corbusier had stolen all his ideas, that without him he would never have discovered Adolphe Floss, without him he would never have looked at motor cars, etc. So Aux Enfants tried to take credit, telling, in short, I breastfed you and you bit my breast. And this is exactly what Le Corbusier represents in this drawing. Corbu, who was very well fed, bit the breast of his breastfeeding mother. Very, very good likeness in the representation of Aux Enfants, and Le Corbusier himself can probably cannot be clearly identified with this very prosperous baby. As soon as the book is published in French, proposals for translation abound, and the first one, the proposals for translation in Germany abound. The book is greeted very, very positively in Germany, and the Germans are the first one to try to reshape the book for the German audience. The translator is Hans Hildebrandt, a Stuttgart-based art historian, and his archives are here. And in the archives, I found a very amusing letter in which Hildebrandt writes to Le Corbusier to discuss a series of terms in his translation, and telling him that there are a series of points he doesn't understand. He doesn't understand, for instance, that coco in the text is an allusion to cocaine and not to sort of coconut / anise drink, licorice drink, which is used in France. And he doesn't understand, this is more revealing of the problems the book will meet in its diffusion. He doesn't understand the term poché. Poché is a term which was widely used at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which signified, which in a way denoted the way of representing walls on a plan. In order to represent the thickness of a wall, you would draw a line which was then filled with a pochoir, a particular panel called a pinceau à pocher. So, but the term was mistaken by Hildebrandt, who understood it as a term of cuisine, as being, in fact, a term used to poach eggs. And so we see Le Corbusier here telling, das sind poché. Corb understands, writes in German on the letter, das sind poché. It's not a term. Can I translate it by Kochkunst, the art of cooking, or cooking recipe? No. This is poché. So, and for years and years, Le Corbusier will prevent Hildebrandt from translating further books. He had already signed the contract for the second one, but after that, he would, of course, keep him away from the translation. The English translation was made in 1928, 27, by a young architect and artist called Frederick Etchels, who had lived in Paris. He had not had the initiative. The initiative was John Rotker's, who was a publisher and a translator himself of poetry, who was very interested into an extremely interested observer of the Paris scene. The book was completely reshaped with a new introduction by Etchels, in which he tried very awkwardly to emulate what Le Corbusier was doing in the book he was introducing. So here, images of a lock in Liverpool, views of sinks, of operation rooms, of modernist rooms. He completely degraded and decredibilized the book by introducing these rather mediocre images at the beginning. More significantly, he completely betrayed the problematic of Le Corbusier. Here we see one of the most obvious mistakes, translating volume in the Remainders to Architect as mass. And it's really interesting to know that generations and generations of Anglophone architectural students have read, on one hand, this book, Remainder to the Architect's Mass, and the book by Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock on the international style, in which principle number one of the international style is, colon, volume replaces mass. So now, finally, the truth is made clear if this translation is to be read. The book became a canon for many people and in many ways. It became a canon for Le Corbusier himself, and here we see at the end of the 1920s a number of books he had published on the same principle, recycling articles of L'Esprit Nouveau and continuing after the death of L'Esprit Nouveau this collection. So if Le Corbusier was a producer of books as much as a producer of buildings, we have here one of the clearest archetypes, not only in terms of the book's size, but in terms of its format, in terms of its structure, in terms of its way of manipulating images and text. It also became a canon for other architects. Here we see on the left, the book published 1 year later in Moscow by Moise Ginsberg, Style and Epoch. Ginsberg, who had been in Italy, had photos of other Italian planes than the Caproni ones published by Le Corbusier, and used them. On the right, by a slightly younger rival of Le Corbusier in Paris, André Lursa, a book entitled Architecture, published in 1929. And we see an attempt also at creating, rather awkwardly, an original modernist layout, and with a page opening with a bridge, which is not the Garabi bridge like Le Corbusier, but another southern French bridge. So here we have two cases of which make me think of students trying to plagiarize by using slightly offset images and examples. The book was greeted with many critics in the French press and in the international press. The English translation was in particular greeted by a remarkable article of Edwin Lutyens. So what is amazing about this book is probably the fact that it triggered more response than all the buildings Le Corbusier built at the same time. Lutyens published in 1928 an article in The Observer under the title The Robotism of Architecture. He declared himself amused, sometimes excited, sometimes angry at the boil of Mr. Le Corbusier's emotion. He did not impugn the delightful photographs of grain elevators, but he took umbrage at the connection between the Parthenon, a pure creation of the mind. This is what Le Corbusier says. Lutyens adds, a pure creation of mind, of fair and fine minds, and the airplane, Lutyens continues, I quote, which one faulty stay or bolt may crash to the ground, end quote. Fortunately to him, the lesson of Rome comes as a relief, end quote. The book takes the reader, he writes, down a channel of architectural adventure, but its axiom ring falls to Lutyens, who opines that if it is to be a home, a house cannot be a machine. Above all, for him, emotion will never be controlled by sparking plugs, and the logic of a French mind may make a Corbusier house or even a Versailles, but never a Hampton Court. The houses of Le Corbusier, the ones promised in the book, can thus only be for robots, and blind ones at that. Last quote, robots without eyes, for eyes that have no vision cannot be educated to see. In 1945, the first book published by Bruno Zevi was entitled Towards an Organic Architecture. Since that, we've had the book by Jona Friedman, Towards a Scientific Architecture. Many Italian books, Verso un'architettura sostenibile, Verso un'architettura di oggi. The most original one being probably a book published by the Aga Khan Foundation, Towards an Architecture in the Spirit of Islam. And recently, a very useful book, I advise you to read it, by Catherine de Smet, Vers une architecture du livre, Towards an Architecture of the Book, which is a study of Le Corbusier's books. Yes, and finally, I could discuss at long all the declinations, transformations, imitations, parodies of a book. This is one of the most interesting ones. The collage at left is a very famous collage made by the critic Pietro Maria Bardi in 1931 for the second exhibition of rational architecture in Rome, an exhibition which triggered a sort of shift of Mussolini to radical architecture, and it is clear it is entitled Il tavolo degli orrori, the table of horrors, the relationship with the Rome of horrors, and with the idea of collaging in a pretty more dadaistic way on the left, these buildings being quite clear here. In its very problematic opening eyes that do not see, learning lessons from cities, Vers une architecture also had an impact on the theoretical production of the 1960s and 70s. Robert Venturi's first book, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, is a book which is very often in dialogue with Toward an Architecture in the analysis of Roman examples on top, and also when it functions as a catalogue at the bottom. When Venturi uses his book to present his first project, it is obvious that Vers une architecture is a model. And when he invites his readers to learn from Las Vegas, and the lesson of Rome is not lost. He knew the lesson of Rome and had tried to draw different lessons from Rome's beginning in the 1950s. So here, clearly, the book of Le Corbusier remains a sort of challenge. Of course, Venturi doesn't look at the Vatican or at St. Peter's, but at the Caesar Palace. And when Rainer Banham publishes in 1971 his wonderful Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies, we should remember that he had taken part in the early 1950s to readings of Towards a New Architecture, the HL's translation, organized by the ICA in London. So at a moment in which the ideas of Le Corbusier were discussed, taken up in different manners by Jim Sterling on one hand, by Colin Rowe on another one. So the book will function in many different situations as a book capable of stimulating not only new points, but also new strategies of observation. If we look more carefully at Banham's book, we will see that the very structure of the book can be interpreted as having an homomorphic relationship towards an architecture. There are, and this is not a coincidence, as Banham had himself very cleverly commented in his history of architecture published in 1960, Theory and Design in the First Machine Age. Banham had commented on the division of Le Corbusier's book between chapters devoted to the machine and chapters devoted to specific issues dealing with the permanence of architecture. The homomorphism lies in the composition of his book, in which we find the four ecologies, which are inserted in a sort of sandwich in which also chapters on architecture are inserted. So in a way, the structure of the book is, has learned a lot from Vers une architecture. The book will also trigger sometimes funny, angry reactions, and I'm concluding with that. This is an amazing document found in the archive at the Fondation, a postcard where we see slightly different alternatives than Le Corbusier's proposed, toilet paper or revolution, for instance, here, and a series of scatological puns on the slogans used by Le Corbusier. The postcard is written by one of his fellow young student he had met in Switzerland, who would later emigrate to Brazil. Not a very remarkable character. And I found this in the archive of Gordon Matta Clark at the Canadian Centre of Architecture, which is extremely interesting. It is a letter of Matta Clark in 1973 when he's working at the conspiracy focused on producing the architecture. And what we see on the right, difficult to decipher, is the following text. A machine for not living, with an extract from Corbusier's Verso, une architecture, showing the virgin machine he wants us all to live in. So again, the virgin machine, a different type of machine. This is what Matta Clark proposes. So what we see here, at the time, Matta Clark knew the book because it had been discussed by Colin Rowe, among others, at Cornell University, where he had been trained. So what we see here is the incredible destiny of a book which was already a sort of condensation of what Le Corbusier had lived in 2 very intense decades. He would republish the book at the end of his life in 1958, and making the interesting decision of not changing it, not adapting it. He would write at that time, "The galleys of my articles then brought together provoked astonishment and indignation at the Arrow printing plant in Tours. They even said, speaking of me, he's a madman." Already, and as regards typography and craft, Vers une architecture testifies to a spirit of its own. In fact, a spirit of observation, a spirit of displacement from the other realms of modern production to architectural literature. In this respect, Le Corbusier's book was unquestionably an eye-opener and a founding book. It is now a true classic, as we see from the sequence of translations, mistranslations, imitations of its structure, of its poetics. As we see, if classicism is a work which can be successfully plagiarized, taken ironically, displaced, and opposed, then the book is a successful classic. Thank you. Mike. Here, second row.
Well, thank you for that staggering accounting of the book. There was one of the parts that I found most compelling was your attention to the, let's call it layout and composition of each page. And I was wondering whether you are interested in saying more about that in relation to compositions of paintings and compositions of books. I mean, it's almost too obvious But you didn't actually say, does he have a separate compositional, a distinct compositional attitude towards the page as opposed to a painting, as opposed to a book?
I would say that these pages are very contradictory. I think the discourse is truly amazing. Again, a contraposition, the engineering of shocks, of visual paradoxes, etc. But the layout in itself is not so original. I mean, if you compare it to the Dadaist magazines like 391 by Picabia, if you compare it to what was published in Berlin, or to what the Russians were doing, it's strangely neoclassical. So I think the book is, in itself is, in a way, a condensation of the ambiguities of purism. The Manifesto of Enfants and Jean Rey in 1918, after Cubism, which is the founding manifesto of purism, looks at factories and already celebrates the industrial structures, and looks at Greek vases on the other side. So the composition is a rather conservative one, which derives from the German almanacs, the almanac of the Blaue Reiter, the publications of the Werkbund, the unpublished book of France or Germany of 1915 was to be based on a Viennese Werkbund publication, which Jean Rey considered in a letter to Perret as is the best possible model he had in mind. So I think the layout is conservative. But, of course, there is a definite use of proportions in its making, and what is at work. I've not tried to, because it's not the kind of analysis I'm so good at or so interested at, but it's clear that the golden section is used throughout the book in order to compose, to place certain photographs, in order to crop certain photographs also. So the book in itself is clearly related to problems Le Corbusier develops and sets in the paintings and in some of his facades at the same time.
Yeah. Jean-Louis, would you comment on the fact that Le Corbusier was Swiss, that his ability to move between what was going on in Germany and France, and then that he was able to stay professionally active when people like Gropius and Mies were in the army?
Yes, so it's a very complex story. Jean Rey had a very difficult relationship with Switzerland. Le Corbusier also is not yet very well considered now in his hometown of La Chaux-de-Fonds. The Chaux-de-Fonniers think that he's a little overblown, not so interesting. He had a very tough time with his clients. He started a practice in La Chaux-de-Fonds returning from his trips. He had essentially a clientele of Swiss Jewish watchmakers. Some of them remained friends. He had very bad business relationship with the others, and he left the city in 1917 very pissed off. Also with good advice from people like the writer William Ritter, telling him, leave this little city and go to the metropolis. So he left Switzerland, and the education he had in Switzerland was Francophone. He had a lot of trouble to read German and constantly complains in his letters to his parents that he will never be able to speak German properly. Yet he will teach himself German in Munich in 1910, working for Peter Behrens in Berlin, and in the end will be able to read, speak German. But in the 1920s, he will never answer back to his German correspondence in German. He will always say, je ne parle pas bien allemand. There is only one exception, only one. Interestingly, the exception is Mies van der Rohe. The only guy to whom he responds in German, and the letters are heavily faulty and corrected 3 times, are letters to Mies. Yet, what is important is that before 1914, before exactly September 1914, Jean Rey was a complete Germanophile. he ignored completely French architecture. So in his letter to Perret, he says, I don't know anything about French architects. What are the names, your buildings? Labrouste, the architect of the Bibliothèque Nationale. He had known Tony Garnier. He had been to see Tony Garnier, the visionary architect in Lyon, but because he was working on a slaughterhouse project, and he wanted the advice of Garnier, who had done one, and also because he wanted to make business with the mayor of Lyon, so he knew much better German architecture than French architecture, but had an ambiguous relationship to Germany. On one hand, he celebrated in his letters figures like Heinrich Tessenow, the modern traditionalist, or he was very fond of Theodor Fischer, who was the main figure in Munich and the teacher of people like Aude or Mendelssohn, for instance. So he had, and he admired and hated Behrens. In the letters to his parents, he writes the Behrens, l'ours Behrens, but it's better in German and in English. The Behrens. So he had a troubled relationship with Germany, and it shows in all his writings throughout the period. It changed completely. Germanophile, he became Germanophobe in 1914 when the army of the Kaiser bombed the Reims Cathedral. This is a major turning point. A major turning point, not only for him, for all the French intellectuals. The French intellectuals who were anti-war will rally to the war against Germany after the bombing of the Reims Cathedral, which will be a shock for everybody. So, and it is the very trigger of his book on France and Germany. Okay, but let me continue, or I could continue forever on this topic, but let me continue. There is a very interesting paradox. The second most important book of Le Corbusier, probably, is the book called The Complete Works, L'œuvre complète, published in 1930. It is published in Zurich. The first edition is German, and it will remain the only available edition until 1937. So for 7 years, the book in which all his work will be explained to the broader world was in German, and it was almost not sold in France because no one could read German in these circles. So again, the story is very complex. The Swissness of Jeanneret being very important also during the war. When he's writing on France and Germany, he's also located in a country in which the Germanophone cantons are more or less in favor of the Germans during the war, the Francophone ones in favor of France, in which Swiss at large is in a way very ambiguous until finally, as always, the Swiss go on the side of the victors. So he used also Switzerland as a vintage point at that moment, but never again until the 1950s reconstituted a positive relationship.
One more question.
I was wondering if you could talk about some of the influences, which Meyer has read the book, and maybe some of the other modern architects like Frank Gehry.
Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. Le Corbusier has generated emules. Say that in English? Generated emulators from the very beginning, in the 20s already. A guy like Ursa, this architect I've mentioned now, the Russians were already recycling forms of Le Corbusier in the mid-20s. In 1928, Le Corbusier goes to Moscow, and he discovers the building site of a gigantic communal house by Moïse Ginsburg, which is based on his principles. The pilotis, the stilts, the ribbon windows, the flat roof, everything is Corbusier, and it's a building 10 times as large as anything he has built in the West. So at a very, very early moment, Le Corbusier was faced with the proliferation of his work in a more intense and in a more quantitatively more massive manner. And his frustration, which grows during his entire life, and which can be felt, for instance, where you listen to the 24 hours of tape recordings of the French radio archive, you see that he's becoming bitter and bitter every year in front of this, what he perceives as his failure, as opposed to the success of his imitators. And of course, there will be in America in the 1960s, thanks to the teaching of people like Colin Rowe at Austin and Cornell, thanks to a sort of deep intellectual reconsideration of Le Corbusier and also an artistic reconsideration of his work, a generation of, or two of American architects who will try to transfer positions and sometimes shapes. So some of these architects, like Mayer, have been on the side of transfer of forms. Others have had a more intellectualized attitude to Le Corbusier. I'm thinking of someone like Peter Eisenman, for instance. So it's not only a story which deals with Mayer, but it's really a collective attitude in America at the time in which Venturi draws completely different conclusions of the same, basically the same readings. And apropos Frank Gehry, I have a very interesting anecdote. In 2 years ago, Frank was received in Paris a medal from the French Minister of Culture. No, I think it was last year. It was even last year. The medal of Chevalier des Arts et Lettres, Knights of Arts and Letters. Maybe more than Chevalier is the first grade, which is what I am, but he must be at least 2 grades above. So probably Commandeur des Arts et Lettres. So, and the minister gave a speech written by one of his aides saying, and your inspiration comes from your trips when you visited France in the 1950s. Your inspiration was given, this idea of sculptural architecture came to you when you visited the chapel of Ronchamp by Le Corbusier. And Gehry listened, and then he gave a speech in which he didn't mention Le Corbusier at all, but said, and my relationship to sculpture and to the relationship between architecture and sculpture came when I visited the Romanesque church of Autun and the wonderful work of Gislebertus d'Autun. So here one sees that no great architect is an analphabet, and that the dealings, the observation, and the interiorization of history is what makes these men, these humans great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.